Glenn Kirshner, I want to ask you, because this all sort of dovetails here, about the new Attorney General nominee who will have his hearings today, William Barr, set to begin in just a few hours. 2 days, we're expecting a pretty grueling questioning with a big focus on the potential future of Robert Mueller's Russia probe. Barr expected to tell members of the Senate Judiciary Committee he believes Mueller's investigation should continue unimpeded. That's according to prepared remarks obtained by NBC News. In those remarks, Barr also plans to say the public should be informed of the results of that investigation, writing, "My goal will be to provide as much transparency as I can, consistent with the law." Barr continues, "I can assure you that where judgments are to be made by me, I will make those judgments based solely on the law and will let no personal, political, or other improper interests influence my decisions." In a letter to the committee's chairman, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, Barr reiterated his views on the Russia probe, adding he believes a president can obstruct justice. But Democrats on the committee, including at least 3 potential 2020 presidential contenders, are expected to hammer Barr on a memo he wrote last year in which he criticized Mueller's investigation. At that time, he wrote that the special counsel, quote, should not be permitted to demand that the president submit to interrogation about alleged obstruction, adding, apart from whether Mueller has a strong enough factual basis for doing so, Mueller's obstruction theory is fatally misconceived. So, Glenn, William Barr can say what he wants to in these hearings, and I'm glad he's saying publicly and on the record and in sworn testimony that it ought to go forward and that the results should be made public. But his initial feelings about the investigation, his core feelings, remain true as published in that memo.
Yeah, Willie, it was almost a surprise, I think, when the president first announced he would nominate Bill Barr, because Bill Barr was viewed as something of an institutionalist, a law and order guy, someone who, by all accounts, seemed to be deeply concerned with the reputation and the integrity of the Department of Justice. So I think after the president installed, Whitaker, who seemed entirely inappropriate for the position, I think people were pleasantly surprised that he appointed a Bill Barr. And that was until people realized that Bill Barr had authored this, let's call it curious memo, I believe in June, and he just sort of, as a private citizen, offered it up to the Department of Justice. And, Willie, what I think is most enlightening is the very first sentence or two of that memo. And if I could just read it, it says that, quote, "I realize that I am in the dark about many of the facts, but I hope my views might be useful." It's curious that Bill Barr, unsolicited, would send a memo to the Department of Justice admitting that he is completely in the dark about the facts of Robert Mueller's investigation, and then go on for 19 single-spaced pages to criticize the Mueller probe and to lay out this broad, sweeping executive power in what he calls the facially lawful act doctrine. Basically, he took the position that if the president does something that is authorized by the Constitution, i.e., hire or fire a cabinet secretary or a director of the FBI, it is necessarily a lawful act and it should not be investigated. That is a really aggressive, curious position to take. Now, we're all heartened that Bill Barr has said all the right things in his opening statement, but it is just that, an opening statement. Let's see what kind of questions he has to endure during today's hearing.
Glenn, it is curious at best, and it reminds me of Whitaker, who announced to people that he was going on CNN to apply for a job with Donald Trump's Justice Department. It looks like they're playing to the cheap seats here. And in Barr's case, you can't help but look back at the president's last Supreme Court pick, Brett Kavanaugh, who wasn't really even on the first list that the Federalist Society put out. But he had written that 2009 law review article that said that a president couldn't be indicted, and suddenly he zooms to the top of the list. Now here's Barr, again, basically playing to Donald Trump. And out of nowhere, this Bushy, this establishment figure, this supposed law and order guy suddenly zooms to the front of the list when it just doesn't seem to make sense.
It does seem pretty transparent, Joe. Now, I will say when we look back at Barr's prior tenure as Attorney General from 1991 to 1993, it's interesting. I went back and looked at some of the reporting, and I think it was the Los Angeles Times reported that his confirmation hearing back in 1991 was, quote, unusually placid, close quote. I suspect that this confirmation hearing will be anything but unusually placid, but it does seem pretty transparent, just as the president. Go ahead.
So, but Glenn, let's ask though. Okay, so let's say he lets this go all the way to the end. How could Attorney General Barr undercut Robert Mueller's investigation, even if he lets it conclude? I mean, could he not decide that he's going to just hold all the findings and not release it, not allow it to go public? Are there other things he could do to actually undermine Robert Mueller's work?
There are things he can do, because if Robert Mueller wants to take a specific step in the investigation, for example, let's just say hypothetically he seeks approval to return an indictment against Roger Stone as one of the co-conspirators in the whole WikiLeaks debacle. Now, he would have to get permission from the person supervising the probe. It was Rod Rosenstein. We assume it will become Bill Barr. Bill Barr could withhold that approval. It seems to us that that's unlikely, given even what's been publicly reported about Roger Stone. But Bill Barr would have the authority in his capacity as the person supervising the Mueller probe to withhold that approval. He would have to report it out at the end of the day to Congress, because there's a daylight provision that says any denial of a request by special counsel ultimately has to be reported out to Congress. But he could take those kind of steps. But one other thing, Joe, when I heard in his opening comments that he intends to give that he knows Bob Mueller personally, he worked with Bob Mueller, he respects Bob Mueller, I was encouraged, heartened even, because, I learned how to try murder cases in Washington, D.C. from Bob Mueller, my direct supervisor in the late 90s. So anybody who knows Bob Mueller, knows the man, knows where his heart and his principles and his ethics are, that's a very good sign, I think, for the way Bill Barr will approach his relationship with Bob Mueller. I, for one, politics aside, I'll jump in a foxhole and fight the enemy with Bob Mueller any day, knowing the man he is.
I think a lot of people would. And David French actually yesterday had a great column talking about how he was a sheepdog, defending the rest of us against the wolves. Glenn Kirshner, thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Just one interesting side note: there are a lot of people that are saying right now that Robert Mueller's investigation is winding down. We've now been hearing that for 14 months. Remember Donald Trump's lawyer, Ty Cobb, was constantly saying, it's going to be over by Thanksgiving.
Giuliani was pushing him to hurry up.
Giuliani said this is going to be. We don't know when this is going to be over. We could have another 6 months ahead of us, or maybe there will be a report written in the next month or two. Who knows? Only Robert Mueller knows, and people speculating right now are actually making a big mistake.
Well, what we're seeing is how many different angles there are, how much there is. When you think of like Elijah Cummings on oversight trying to figure out what questions to ask, they have to be so careful, so quick on their feet, because this is massive. Could take a long time.